thing, you can go back and find out about it. And also, then you can always find your beautiful faces on my YouTube thread. Okay, so just to introduce everybody, I think we have, so Adina Karst is a former congregant of mine when I was rabbi at Temple Bat Yam in South Lake Tahoe. And you still in Carson City, Adina?
You're muted.
I had to unmute. Yeah, I had to unmute it. Well, I have a dog that sometimes barks and a husband that's doing a lot of things. Yeah, I'm still in Carson, yes.
Wonderful. Yes. So I've known Adina for a long time. Faye and Mike are regular participants in learning here in Buffalo. They are members of Temple Bet Zion. Bridget has returned recently from France and is so we're thrilled to have her back. And Jude and Theo are our youngest members. Actually, Jude gets to count as our youngest member. He is related to me. I happen to be privileged to be his parent. And Theo is has joined this group on his own as a young person. So Theo, you're headed into 10th grade this year, aren't you? Should there be school? You're muted though.
That I am, sorry. If this subsists, hopefully I will be going into 10th grade.
All right, excellent. So that's our group. Normally some other people will join us. So the question is that I asked, why are we talking about anti-Semitism? So I have a bunch of articles from recent times for us to take a look at. And then we're going to go into ancient history. So this is from the Washington Post. It is from yesterday. It is from the AP. The headline is Eagles wide receiver Deshaun Jackson apologizes for anti-Semitic post. For those of you who don't know, Deshaun Jackson, he is a football player for the Philadelphia Eagles. And it says here, Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver Deshaun Jackson has apologized after backlash for sharing anti-Semitic posts on social media over the weekend. Jackson initially posted a screenshot of a quote widely attributed to Adolf Hitler saying, in part, Jews will blackmail America. In another post, Jackson showed support for Louis Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam leader who is known for his anti-Semitic rhetoric. My post was definitely not intended for anybody of any race to feel any type of way, especially the Jewish community, Jackson said in a video he posted on Instagram on Tuesday. I post things on my story all the time and just probably never should have posted anything Hitler did because Hitler was a bad person and I know that. The team issued the following statement. So this is from the Philadelphia Eagles. We've spoken with Deshaun Jackson about his social media posts. Regardless of his intentions, the messages he shared were offensive, harmful, and absolutely appalling. They have no place in our society and are not condoned or supported in any way by the organization. We are disappointed and we reiterated to Deshaun the importance of not only apologizing, but also using his platform to take action to promote unity, equality, and respect. We are continuing to evaluate the circumstances and are committed to continuing to have productive and meaningful conversations with Deshaun, as well as all of our players and staff in order to educate, learn, and grow. Everybody say hi to Ginny.
Hi, everybody.
There's Adina Karst from the past. Ginny is playing the role of coffee fairy at the moment. So this is this week, and we have the NFL, the Philadelphia Eagles, and an NFL player dealing with a quote of Hitler on Twitter. Why is anti-Semitism still out there? Why are people still talking about this in 2020? What is going on? Well, let's go back in history a little bit. For those of you who haven't read this, this is one of my favorite books. This is James Carroll's Constantine's Sword. The Church and the Jews, A History. This book is, hi Joan, hi Larry and Lucille, welcome everybody. Just FYI, we are recording today, so if you don't want your video live, feel free to blank your video. So James Carroll's Constantine's Sword is an old book. It came out almost 20 years ago, I think. So depending upon your perspective on age, it is an old book. Yeah, 2001. And nonetheless, everything he talks about is still current and relevant, unfortunately. And so the question of why anti-Semitism is still relevant it has to start with why anti-Semitism is such a big deal to begin with. And we can call it whatever we like. A lot of people are trying to move away from the term anti-Semitism today because it's sort of abstract and move towards sort of Jew hatred, which is a little bit more specific. And of course, who is a Semite, technically speaking? A Semite is not just a Jewish person, it's almost every Middle Eastern person. So in the dictionary definition. So anti-Semitism seems to be not necessarily exactly what we're saying. In any event, James Carroll, interesting guy, was headed towards the priesthood and then didn't go into the priesthood and became a reporter for the Boston Globe. And he's been an author of a number of books, as it shows here. And this book starts in the most interesting of places. It starts outside of Auschwitz. And it turns out to be a very important place to start. So we're going to read for a little bit from here because I think it gets us into the question of why we're here today. So this is chapter 1, Sign of Folly. The cross is made of stout beams, an intersection of railroad ties. It stands in a field of weeds that slopes down from the road. The field is abutted on one side by the old theater where gas canisters were stored, also looted gold, where much later Carmelite nuns accomplished cloistered works of expiation, sparking fury, and where now a municipal archive is housed. On another side, the field runs up against the brick wall, the eastern limit of the main camp. At more than 20 feet, the cross nearly matches the height of the wall, although not the wall's rusted thistle of barbed wire. Immediately beyond are the camp barracks, the peaked roofs visible against the gray morning sky. The nearest building, close enough to hit with a stone thrown from the foot of the cross, is Barracks 13, also known as the Death Bunker or the Starvation Bunker. In one of its cells, the Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe was martyred. He is now a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. Kolbe is the reason for this cross. In 1979, Karol Wojtyla came home to nearby Krakow as Pope John Paul II. He celebrated Mass in an open field for 1 million of his countrymen, and on the makeshift altar, this same cross had been mounted, hence its size, large enough to prompt obeisance from the farthest member of the throng. Visiting the death camp, the Pope prayed for and to Father Kolbe, who had voluntarily taken the place of a fellow inmate in the death bunker. The Pope prayed for and to Edith Stein, the convert who had also died in the camp, and whom he would declare a Catholic saint in 1998. She was a Carmelite nun known as Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, but the Nazis murdered her for being a Jew. In his sermon that day, the Pope called Auschwitz the Golgotha of the modern world. As he had at other times, John Paul II expressed the wish that a place of prayer and penance could be built on the site of the death camp to honor the Catholic martyrs and to atone for the murders. At Auschwitz, at its subcamp Birkenau, the Nazis killed perhaps as many as 250,000 non-Jewish Poles, and a group of Carmelite nuns moved into the old theater in the autumn of 1984. They intended especially to offer prayers in memory of their sister Teresa Benedicta. The mother superior of this group was herself named Teresa. So what's missing in the Pope's prayers when he comes to Auschwitz?
He's missing any sympathy for the Jewish victims
Right.
and other non-Catholics.
So the start of this book is a strange way to start a conversation on the history of the church and the Jews, but it is important because it's what got James Carroll here. He got here because he said, what the heck is going on with Catholics at Auschwitz? Why are Catholics and the Pope and a Polish pope of all people, turning Auschwitz into a holy site for Catholic memorializing. And it, of course, gets worse, not better, right?
Right.
So the Carmelite presence at the gate of Auschwitz was immediately protested by leaders of Jewish groups throughout Europe and in the United States and Israel. Many of you may remember this. Stop praying for the Jews who were killed in the Shoah, one group pleaded. Let them rest in peace in Jews. Jewish protesters invaded the grounds of the convent, carrying banners that said, "Leave our dead alone and do not Christianize Auschwitz and Shoah." The protesters registered complaints about Father Kolbe, who before his arrest had been the publisher of a journal that had printed anti-Semitic articles, and about Edith Stein, whose conversion could only look to Jews like apostasy, meaning she'd abandoned Judaism for Christianity, which of course is what an apostate is, right? Somebody who's abandoned our own group. Polish Catholics from the nearby towns of Oświęcim and Birkenau rallied to the nuns' defense. Fights broke out. One more horror. Auschwitz read a headline in a British paper. "They crucified our God," a boy screamed during one demonstration. "They killed Jesus." At one point, the nuns' supporters arrived carrying the stout wooden cross from the papal altar in Krakow. They planted the cross in the field next to the old theater. However piously intended, it could seem a stark act of Christian sovereignty, a sacrilege. Eventually, John Paul II intervened in the dispute, offering to fund a new convent building for the Carmelites a few hundred yards away. He prevailed on the nuns to move. The sisters did so in 1994. In the compromise that was worked out, Jewish leaders in turn accepted that the cross would remain in the field near the wall, but only temporarily. In early 1998, the Polish government, perhaps responding to pressure from American senators friendly to Jews, pressure exerted just prior to the US Senate's vote on Poland's admission to NATO, announced that the cross, like the convent before it, would be removed. The cross overlooks the camp, which is unacceptable for Orthodox Jews, a Polish official said, because it imposes Christian symbols. But a month later, before the removal had occurred, Poland's Roman Catholic primate, Cardinal Josef Glemp, insisted that the cross should remain where it was. Jewish leaders again protested, prompting an expression of concern from the Vatican. At Auschwitz itself, Polish Catholics began to plant new crosses appropriate to a cemetery, making the point that Catholics too died at the camp. The dispute raged throughout 1998 with escalations even to the point of homemade explosive devices being planted in the field by radical Catholics. More than 100 small crosses were put in the ground. Finally, in 1999, in an odd compromise, quote unquote compromise, the Polish parliament passed a law requiring the removal of the smaller crosses but making the papal cross permanent. The small crosses were taken away by Polish officials, but the large cross remains at Auschwitz to this day. What does the cross of Jesus Christ mean at such a place? What does it mean to Jews? What does it mean to Christians or to Polish Catholics or to those for whom religious symbols are empty? And what does the cross there signal about our understanding of the past and what of the future? If Auschwitz has become a sacred center of Jewish identity, what does the cross there imply about the relations between Jews and Christians and between Judaism and Christianity? These questions were in my mind one November morning as I stood alone before the cross. So let's put ourselves in Mr. Carroll's shoes. Here is a person who's a believing Catholic who abandoned going to the priesthood but didn't stop being a Catholic, who shows up at Auschwitz. Now, why do people visit Auschwitz? Why does anybody visit Auschwitz?
Do you remember what happened?
More.
Right.
There's more than one reason.
There is more than one reason, but it is primarily a Jewish memorial. This is a place where over 1 million Jews died, were killed and murdered by an anti-Semitism that was so virulent that it wiped out 1/3 of the Jewish population at that time. There is whatever happened to Catholics at Auschwitz, it is nothing in comparison to what happened to Jews at Auschwitz. So whether one is Jewish or Catholic or Hindu or Muslim, if one is visiting this place in rural Poland outside Auschwitz, one is there because of the horrible thing that was done to Jews. There is no other reason to be there. The martyrdom of a Catholic priest and a Catholic nun and a few other Catholics in Auschwitz is a drop in the bucket to Catholic history in comparison to what it is to Jewish history. And furthermore, what gives Catholics the right, the even concept, the idea that they should be there? And this is at the heart of the origins of anti-Semitism. It's why starting here and not starting elsewhere is so important, because we have to see where we've gotten to understand where we started. Listen to what Carol continues with. I thought of the Pope's designation of this place as Golgotha, and I recognized the ancient Christian impulse to associate extreme evil with the fate of Jesus, precisely as a way of refusing to be defeated by that evil. At the Golgotha of the crucifixion, death became the necessary mode of transcendence, first for Jesus, and then, as Christians believe, for all. But I also thought of that banner, do not Christianize Auschwitz and Shoah and the Holocaust. Can mechanized mass murder be a mode of transcendence? I could imagine the narrowed eyes of a Jewish protester as he detected in prayers offered before the cross at Auschwitz echoes of the old refrain, Jews out. Only now, was it Jewish anguish that was expected to yield before Christian hope? If Auschwitz must stand for Jews as the abyss in which meaning itself died, what happens when Auschwitz becomes the sanctuary of someone else's recovered piety? Christians are not the only ones who have shown themselves ready to use the memory of the 6 million to advance an ideology. Orthodox Jews can see a punishment for secularism. Zionists can see an organizing rationale for the state of Israel. Opponents of land for peace can see a justification for a permanent garrison mentality. The memorialists who have raised the new temples of Holocaust museums and memorials in the cities of the West have anointed memory itself as the deepest source of meaning. The legend engraved at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the first Holocaust memorial, reads, forgetfulness is the way to exile. Remembrance is the way to redemption. So key issue, right? Who are all the others in this paragraph who are using an ideology, the Shoah, the Holocaust, as something to advance an ideology? Who are these people? They're all Jews, right? Orthodox Jews, Zionists, opponents of land for peace, memorialists are all Jews or participating in some Jewish project. It somehow or another, we have a pluralism of an incredible variety of Jewish approaches to this. And nonetheless, and that seems reasonable, it happened to us. And even memorializing it, like, and Germans more than anybody have used the Holocaust as a memorial and a remembering for the sake of change. And in their own history, they understand it as a landmark of horror that they should never repeat, more perhaps than any other people. They have been reflective about the Holocaust in a very profound way. However, hi Ethel, and hi Susan, and hi Joan and Linda, all of you who have arrived. However, what is it that says Christians, specifically Catholics, have a right to this? And in Judaism, over the last 75 years, this quote from Yad Vashem, right here, is very central to Jewish identity. Remembrance of the Holocaust has become one of the 3 major elements of Jewish continuity. When the Pew Foundation did the Jewish population study, the first one, the last big one a couple of years ago, most Jewish sociologists and anthropologists looked at 3 markers of Jewish identity as to whether or not somebody considers themselves really Jewish, right? So somebody who buys into the 21st century American Jewish project from the Jewish demographer perspective believes three things. One, they're proud to be Jewish. Two, they believe Israel should exist and they're pro the state, a Jewish homeland. And three, they believe we should remember the Holocaust. Remembrance of the greatest Jewish tragedy in recent history is essential to Jewish identity today. That makes sense. So this quote is a big deal. Any questions or comments before we move on? You guys are quiet today. Okay.
This is difficult for me.
Why?
I've been writing about my past generations, Latvia and Poland, and the anti-Semitism, and just rounding up the group of Jews. They dig a big hole and then they're just shot. They don't even get to the concentration camp. And just all of this. And I read where someone compared wearing the mask because of the virus like being in a concentration camp, a Nazi concentration camp. And it's like, are you kidding me? You know.
Yes, we are, look.
This whole thing is just.
So we are facing a crisis with regard to intellectual history. And this is difficult. People are using pseudo-knowledge to draw ideological lines today. It is why we're talking about this, because at the heart of anti-Semitism, at the heart of Jew hatred, is a use of somebody else to self-describe. I would say that at the heart of all of this is that, and I derive this from James Carroll to some extent, is that as soon as my self-definition depends on somebody else. So early Christians described themselves first and foremost as not Jews. We are not like those people. We don't do circumcisions. We don't keep kosher. We don't have all of these rules. We're just going to focus on the 10 Commandments. We have Jesus and they refuse to have Jesus. That's a lot of self-definition that depends on somebody else. And that's troubling because that means that other person plays a large role in the self-identification. What does it mean to be Jewish? To be Jewish means I accept the traditions and the peoplehood of Judaism as mine. I declare myself to be one of us and declare us to be the Jewish people. And then there are a whole bunch of details. We argue about what we believe, but first and foremost, we are belonging. Our positive definition does not depend on anyone else. You can see the remnants of the argument between Jews and Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries in the Passover Seder. The wicked child comes in and says, what does all of this mean to you? Which happens to be the same question that the simple child asks, but the answer is different, right? The parent responding to the wicked child says, to me, you've excluded yourself. You're not one of us anymore. You're someone else. Had you been in Egypt, you wouldn't have been saved. Because what you have said is what happens to you, not what happens to us. That wicked child is the child following Jesus in the 2nd century. That is the child who has said, hey, there's this other thing out there. And the controversy there is whether or not we as Jews are a first person plural. Are we going to be us, or are you going to say that you are you and I am me? This is different self-definition. at the heart of Christianity is being not Jewish. That's very hard. Now, that's not at the heart of all Christianity today. That's at the heart of early Catholicism, right? Let's distinguish between the idea that started and the idea that exists, right? There are more than 2 billion Christian people in the world. Catholics and Protestants combined make something like 2 billion plus people. It's a massive group of people. So we don't categorize anybody as representing all of that. What we're looking at here is the origin of this idea. How it manifests today is totally different. So we need to be careful to not flip and regeneralize about other people in a way that people who hate Jews generalize about Jews. So, by the way, there's another interesting question to ask ourselves as we go through this, because I think it's also one of the fundamental questions in dealing with pluralist society, a multi-ethnic society. One can tell one is a member of a group that is excluded if one is asked to represent the opinions of that entire group. So for example, I'm a rabbi. I am a public Jew. And nonetheless, I will, and which is understandable, I will be asked regularly, what do Jews think about this? Right? How can you support Israel? How can you do this? And in fact, what's interesting is I imagine if we were to ask some of our young people on the call, and I'm not going to put either Theo or Jude on the spot, but I would imagine that both of them as students, publicly Jewish students in schools that are not majority Jewish, have been asked at one point or another to defend what Jews think of this. And is there a unanimous opinion among Jews about anything?
That's a joke.
Right.
100% no.
It's in,
A big point of Judaism is the fact that we argue about everything.
I think
absolutely.
that's what we can agree on. We can agree and always argue.
Yeah.
And
That's about it.
how about an African-American person? Are African-Americans responsible for all Black people?
Make it even simpler. Just ask an American in Europe, ask an American what all the Americans think of Donald Trump. I mean,
But that's outside of our country. And then we embrace then we are in foreign territory. What is interesting is every one of us who is not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American will at some point be asked to account for our subgroup. No one went to every white American after the Tree of Life shooting and said, what are you doing about white American extremism? How come you white people are so violent to Jewish people? No one said that. That's the difference. If we are in our homes, Mike, you put your finger on it, asked to account for who we are as if we are in a foreign country, then we are subject to some form of oppression.
I hadn't thought of it that way. That's a good metric.
Well, you provided it. All right, continuing on with James Carroll. The God who led a people out of Egypt is, of course, a redeeming God. But at Auschwitz, the question must have become, are God's saving acts only in the past? Some formerly religious Jews saw in the Holocaust only the absence of God and moved on without faith. Other Jews went from atheism to the faith of Job, an affirmation devoid of piety. There are the Jewish voices from Elie Wiesel to Richard Rubinstein to Emil Fackenheim, who reject the idea that suffering such as Jews underwent in the death camps, 1 million children murdered, can be meaningful. To value those deaths in such a way is to diminish their horror. And there are the voices of Emmanuel Levinas, who spoke of the Holocaust as a tumor in the memory, and Theodore Adorno, who in a famous essay argued that the entire enterprise of education must change after the Holocaust. Auschwitz negates all systems, opposes all doctrines, Wiesel argues. They cannot but diminish the experience which lies beyond our reach. These and other figures insist that the Holocaust shatters all previous categories of meaning, certainly including Christian categories. But isn't the state of being shattered, once reflected upon and articulated, itself a category? Does the very act of thinking about the Holocaust, in other words, diminish its horror by refusing to treat it as unthinkable? The more directly one faces the mystery of the Holocaust, the more elusive it becomes. Perhaps the voice a troubled Christian most needs to hear is that of the Jew who says the Holocaust must be made to teach nothing. What consequences then are to be drawn from the Holocaust, asks the theologian Jacob Neusner. I argue that none are to be drawn, none for Jewish theology and none for the life of Jews with one another, which were not there before 1933. Jewish theologians do no good service to believers when they claim that Auschwitz denotes a turning point. That voice is useful because if Jewish responses to the Holocaust, which range from piety to nihilism, are complex and multifaceted, Christian interpretations of the near elimination of Jews from Europe, however respectfully put forth, must inevitably even be more problematic. The cross signifies the problem. When suffering is seen to serve a universal plan of salvation, its particular character as tragic and evil is always diminished. The meaningless can be made to shimmer with an eschatological hope, and at Auschwitz, this can seem like blasphemy. This is very important, and it's not so easy to understand. At the heart of Christian thinking, at the heart of some Christian thinking, is that suffering is meaningful. Jesus died for our sins is the suffering of God from a Christian perspective is a connection between God and humanity. And the eschatological hope here is the hope that all of our suffering will be transformed into paradise eventually. That's what it's saying here. What Jacob Neusner is pointing out is that Jewish theology must be stronger than current events, even the worst of current events. That if our idea about the way the world is made is shifted by how humans treat one another, then our theology is flawed. Because we knew humans were cruel and terrible to each other before the Holocaust. We knew that suffering existed and was often meaningless before the Holocaust. If our theology is so frail as to be shifted by human activity, then our understanding of God is also paper thin. And so what Neusner is saying is that I still believe that Judaism is important in spite of the Holocaust. I'm not going to shift what my belief in God because of it. I am going to believe, to put it differently, a colleague of mine, a Reconstructionist rabbi who was suffering from some particular personal tragedy at some point, turned to their teenage child and said, I really don't know if I can still believe in God because suffering has been so difficult for me right now. And their child turned to them and said, look, we don't believe in a God that we can stop believing in.
Wow.
Yes, our understanding of theology is bigger than our personal preferences or belief systems at the moment, because the universe is bigger than us. We are humble in front of the face of it. Part of the theological difference between Christianity and Judaism is Christianity is all about humanizing God. And the course of Judaism, from Genesis through the end of our holy books, which end with Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, from the time of the Bible through the Talmud, through modern times, is not a bringing us closer to a smaller version of God, but expanding our sense of the universe and our sense of God so that we understand how even in our smallness, we are connected to that which we don't understand. God gets bigger and more complicated over the course of Judaism because Judaism and Jews grow larger and more complicated. And the more complicated we understand the universe to be, the more distant God is as a concrete concept. We can still be intimately connected to our concept of the divine, but we can't make it small.
So couldn't you say the attempt to Christianize Auschwitz is an attempt by Poles or the Polish government to deal with the implication of participation by Poles and the Polish government during World War II,
Absolutely.
and to try to sanitize that?
Part of the issue with Auschwitz is that it is a stain on Christian conscience. And so when Catholics reinterpret Auschwitz, that there is an attempt to de-Catholicize it. Now, what's interesting is there is absolutely a difference between the anti-Semitism of the Nazis and the anti-Semitism of the Pope who allowed the Nazis to do what they did. Catholic anti-Semitism requires the existence of Jews.
Right.
Again, go back to the self-definition stuff. If my self-definition is dependent on not being like someone else, that someone else still needs to be around. The eradication philosophy, the final solution philosophy of the Nazis and of Hitler is not Catholic. However, it could not come about without Catholicism.
Right, without it being enabled.
Correct. So it's complicated for Christians, specifically for, yes, Theo.
When you say that it could not come about without Catholicism, are you saying that it could not come about had not Catholic anti-Semitism led to it, or it could not have come about without Catholicism not stopping it?
Both, but primarily the former.
Okay.
Right. By the time we get to the 1930s, as Stalin put it with regard to the Pope, and one of the conferences where the Pope was included with Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt, how many divisions is the Pope bringing to the conference? Meaning, what army does he have? And
the Pope's
so the Catholic
an army before.
Right, but so the Catholic Church in 1937 could not have stopped the Holocaust. However, the Holocaust could not have come about without Catholicism having laid the groundwork in Europe for 1,500 years.
Centuries.
Yeah.
It would have been hard for the Nazis to have established anti-Semitism if it had not existed before them.
Exactly. So we're almost done with the stuff that I wanted to cover from Carol. So just quickly, but what about an effort less ambitious than the search for meaning or the imposition of theology? What if the cross at Auschwitz is an object before which Christians only want to kneel and pray? And fully aware of what happened there, what if we Christians want to pray for Jews? Why does that offend? How can prayers for the dead be a bad thing? But what if such prayers, offered with good intentions, effectively evangelize the dead, make them Christian, right? What if they imply that the Jews who died at Auschwitz are to be ushered into the presence of God by the Jesus whom they rejected, right? What if people praying for Jews dead Jews at Auschwitz are anticipating them to arrive in a Christian heaven? Are Jews then expected to see at last the truth to which all their lives they have been blind? Seeing that truth in the beatific vision, are they then to bow down before Jesus as Messiah in an act of post-mortem conversion? Are the deaths of Jews resulting in them becoming Christian in heaven. Shall the afterlife thus be Judenrein, free of Jews too? Elie Wiesel tells, quote, a joke which is not funny, unquote. It concerns an SS officer whose torment of a Jew consisted in his pretending to shoot the Jew dead, firing a blank, while simultaneously knocking him unconscious. When the Jew regained consciousness, the Nazi told him, you are dead, but you don't know it. You think that you escaped us? We are your masters, even in the other world. Wiesel comments, what the Germans wanted to do to the Jewish people was to substitute themselves for the Jewish God. Here is the question a Christian must ask. Does our assumption about the redemptive meaning of suffering, tied to the triumph of Jesus Christ and applied to the Shoah, inevitably turn every effort to atone for the crimes of the Holocaust into a claim to be the masters of Jews in another world? And this is something that only Christians primarily can do, because do Jews have a fixed sense of the afterlife?
No.
We don't teach from that. We don't tell people this is what heaven is going to look like. We don't tell people this is what God looks like. And so this is the ultimate colonization. This is the imperial imposition of Christianity into the afterlife of dead Jewish people. Which
Like what the Mormons are doing in genealogy to a certain extent.
Right, but for Mormons, it's less offensive because, you know, after all, what impact does it have on us, right? If Mormons are collecting genealogy and they're converting people posthumously, at least they're not doing it at Auschwitz. They're not taking over a Jewish memorial site and saying this is a Mormon site. They're privately and quietly taking people's identities and saying, we're going to populate the afterlife with people like us. And we're going to do that by making everyone like us. It is, in fact, metaphysical colonialization and imperialism in the same way, on the one hand. On the other hand, at least they have the courtesy of doing it in the privacy of their own temples. It's still offensive, but I can't quite find it as much offensive, if that makes sense. And more importantly,
I would agree.
And more importantly, they're not the perpetrators of the crime against us. They didn't come up with anti-Semitism. Once, for Christians to speak among ourselves about the murder of 6 million as a kind of crucifixion would have seemed an epiphany of compassion, paying the Jews the highest tribute, as if the remnant of Israel had at last become in this way the body of Christ. Yet such spiritualizing can appear to do what should have been impossible, which is to make the evil worse. The elimination of Jewishness from the place where Jews were eliminated. The body of Christ? If Jesus had been bodily at Auschwitz, as protesting Jews insisted, he would have died an anonymous victim with a number on his arm, that's all. And he'd have done so not as the Son of God, not as the Redeemer of humankind, not as the Jewish Messiah, but simply as a Jew. And in a twist of history folding back on itself, his crime would have been tied to the cross. He killed our God. That indictment, first brought as an explicit charge of deicide as early as the 2nd century by Bishop Melito of Sardis. Melito of Sardis, by the way, in the 2nd century, one of the biggest promulgators of anti-Semitic ideas ever. He's the source of a lot of our difficulty, was officially quashed by the bishops of the Second Vatican Council in 1965. So look at that. The history of the murder of Jesus accusation starts in the 100s and doesn't end until 1800 years later.
Okay. I found this on the web.
That Siri identified herself as Sardis and started answering my questions on Jewish history. So here we have 1800 years of Catholic accusation of Jews as Christ killers. That at bottom is why it is inconceivable that any Jew should look with equanimity on a cross at Auschwitz, and why no Christian should be able to behold it there as anything but a blow to conscience. Though there were other social and economic conditions which were necessary before theological antecedents of anti-Semitism could be turned into the death camps of our times, the Jewish theologian Richard Rubenstein has written, only the terrible accusation known and taught to every Christian in earliest childhood that the Jews are the killers of the Christ can account for the depth and persistence of this supreme hatred. And this is why I wanted us to get here. This lays the groundwork for the Holocaust. Now, again, Catholic anti-Semitism, as James Carroll will point out throughout Constantine's Sword, is cruel and terrible and awful, but the Catholics could never theologically justify wiping out Jews because we needed to stick around until Jesus returned so we could be proven wrong. Jews could be made to suffer, Jews could be made to live in ghettos, Jews could be prohibited from owning property, Jews could be oppressed, Jews, any number of things could be done to us. Jews could be expelled from England and Spain, but wiping us out was not theologically justifiable in Catholic thinking because, again, we needed to be here when Jesus returned so that we could be proven wrong. Now, what's going on today? This is from June 16th. Anybody recognize this image in the, let's see if we can make it a little bigger here. This is a sign in an image in an Ohio.
So it's the Black Plague.
It is the Black Plague. It is the rat with a yarmulke and a beard, and it is the Black Plague. And who used this image as an anti-Semitic image first in modern times?
I don't know.
The Nazis.
Hitler.
Nazis.
This is a Nazi image from the 1930s brought forward in a protest in March in Ohio, or in April in Ohio. This article is, by the way, from the Anti-Defamation League's Facebook page, website page. Here it says, on June 15th, 2020, a federal grand jury indicted Matthew Patrick Slatzer of Canton, Ohio on weapon charges. Slatzer, a known neo-Nazi, was arrested in February after bringing a gun into a Canton bar and was charged with possession of a firearm by a person with a domestic violence conviction. The investigation began after Slatzer, who, according to police reports, was wearing a sword and hatchet on his belt, entered a business in Stowe, Ohio on May 3rd, 2020. He allegedly stated that he was in the Aryan Brotherhood and that he was going to Kent State to look for Jews. ADL's Center on Extremism has been aware of Slatzer since June 2019 and assisted the Stowe police in their investigation. In April 2020, ADL identified Slatzer as the person holding an anti-Semitic poster depicting a caricature of a Jew as a rat and a Star of David with the words "the real plague" at an April 18th, 2020 protest against stay-at-home orders outside the Ohio State House in Columbus. Slatzer first came to the attention of the ADL when he participated in a June 2019 protest of a gay pride event in Detroit, Michigan, where Slatzer and 9 other individuals associated with the Nationalist Socialist movement shouted obscenities, homophobic and anti-Semitic slurs at festival attendees. In July 2019, the COE, which is the committee on the ADL's Commission on Extremism, Center on Extremism, that's this. The COE identified Slatzer as one of the attendees at a white supremacist unity event held on private property in Tazewell, Tennessee. The event was attended by people associated with the United Federation of Clans of America, American Christian Dixie Knights, and the NSM, the National Socialist Movement, and signaled the start of an alliance which has since fallen apart. In the evening hours of the gathering, Klan members burned a cross, while Slatzer and 2 other NSM members burned a swastika. Those are lovely photos. During a November 9th, 2019 regional NSM meeting hosted by regional leader Daniel Burnside at his home in Ulysses, Pennsylvania, Slater and 2 other individuals received NSM patches during a membership ceremony. One of the individuals who received a patch along with Slatzer appears to be Timothy R. Wilson. In March 2020, Wilson died during a shootout with law enforcement in Belton, Missouri. According to an FBI statement, Wilson allegedly planned to use a car bomb to blow up a local hospital currently coping with the coronavirus outbreak in, quote, an attempt to cause severe harm and mass casualties, unquote. So here is modern day anti-Semitism, contemporary 2020 anti-Semitism in Ohio and throughout our country. Why? Why are people, why is this still here?
Why?
Well, because Jews are the eternal enemy. And when we have when things get bad, people turn to simplistic answers for their suffering. And since we have this history of being painted as the enemy of everybody, the conspiracy behind things, the manipulators, we fall into a caricature of the villain for people who need villains.
We're an easy target.
We are an easy target. We were blamed for the Black Plague. The plague image was not originally a Nazi image. The association of Jews with plague rats in a pop culture format was a Nazi innovation. Bishop Melito of Sardis also came up with the blood libel. The blood libel, of course, is the fictional story that Jews use the blood of not yet baptized Christian babies in the creation of Passover matzah. Obviously, there are any number of problems with that from a Jewish practice perspective, not the least of which it concerns using murder. But more importantly, that blood libel, which started in the 2nd and 3rd centuries in Asia Minor, in Sardis, carried through and led to, in 1235, the English expulsion of the Jews. It was brought up every year. Why is Passover a flashpoint for anti-Semitism? Because of this, and because of the fact that Europeans began to perform passion plays at that time of year around Easter. And in a passion play, the Jews are depicted graphically as the torturers and murderers of Jesus, going back to the deicide stuff, and then there are anti-Jewish pogroms and riots following the passion play. That's what happened in England in 1235, when the English suspected Jews in the disappearance of a Christian boy, and then booted them out. Jews don't start returning to England until Queen Elizabeth's reign in the late 1500s. If we go to one of Hitler's original sources, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forgery that blames Jews for being capitalists, manipulating the world so that they can make profit from war. At the same time, Hitler blames Jews for also being communists. Communists blame Jews for being capitalists. We get to be everybody's enemy. Bridget, I wanted to give you a moment to offer some reflection on anti-Semitism in France, because that's your topic.
Fascinating. It really helped. There was a book that I read by a man who grew up in Poland during the war, and he's lived in Paris since after the war. His name is Merrick Halter, and he wrote a small book about the increasing anti-Semitism in France. And his thesis is that it's based on the Ten Commandments, which I didn't really understand until you described that Christian identity is based on specifically not being Jewish, and that the Ten Commandments and the 6-day work week with the 7th day of rest is all from Jewish identity. But specifically in France, with the Second World War, for my thesis proposal, they never said anything specific about Jewish victims and Vichy collaboration until the 1990s. And in all of the textbooks, they said that the Jewish people who were murdered during the war were French resistors. That was it. And it's only been as of the early 2000s that there have been memorial plaques, such as at schools or in certain neighborhoods, that say these were the students who were deported by the complicit Vichy government only because they were Jewish. And I asked some of the teachers that I worked with in the school, because my thesis proposal is specifically about Holocaust education, if they spoke about Jewish people outside of the Holocaust. And one teacher said, yeah, of course I do. Like, I talk about how we blame them for the bubonic plague and the Dreyfus affair. And I didn't know how to respond, because that's just increasing the anti-Semitism.
So here we have a case of contemporary European culture in a culture driven by academic integrity, right? France's secular culture is one of the most intellectually driven in the world. And nonetheless, there is zero intellectual rigor put towards teaching the history of Jews.
Yeah, that is my central thesis, yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So for comparison purposes, in American culture, we can look at the total ignoring of African American culture and history. So for example, does anybody here know what the Great Migration is?
Yes.
Was there like 3?
Yes, but only because I talked about it with you.
David Alexander, I think you're going to say yes.
After World War II. No, it was after World War I, the industrialization of the industrial heartland in the Midwest required workers, and African Americans moved from the South to, I don't know, Indiana, Illinois.
Why did African Americans move en masse from the South?
Well, I guess you have Jim Crow.
Yes. So
a motivating factor.
There were a lot of lynchings in the 20s.
Not just in the 20s. So wow. I urge everyone to, if you're looking for a good long read that will.
It was a great book.
There is a great book called The Warmth of Other Suns.
Yes, that's the one.
By Isabel Wilkerson. So the Great Migration is one of the biggest American historical movements of people that is not spoken about. We are talking about the movement between 6 and 8 million people from World War I through the 1970s, from the land of Jim Crow, from the traditional South to everywhere else, from New York to Los Angeles. And a lot of it is motivated by the search for work. Most of it is motivated by the search for a place of less oppression. One of the things that Isabel Wilkerson points out is that The state with the largest number of lynchings in the South was Florida. Florida had more lynchings than any other state. There's a whole history of Florida using Jim Crow, nearly slave labor on turpentine fields, and all throughout the late 1800s and the first half of the 20th century. And we don't know this history. And this is exactly parallel to what Bridget is pointing out with regard to French teaching. Albeit, interestingly enough, of course, as Americans, we are not as intellectually rigorous as the French. We are not dedicated to making sure that what we teach in elementary and secondary education is the highest quality, most thoughtful, pedagogical presentation of the best scholarship that we have found. We have made our schools into a battlefield of ideology. And so what Bridget is pointing out with regard to France is all the more horrifying, because at least one could say in French culture, there is a nod to the idea that children need to be taught in a way that represents the best that they can find out there, right? So the French invest in teaching children how to eat vegetables, so that because they believe it is the responsibility of a good person to have a diverse palate and eat healthy food, but not eat healthy Jewish history. So if I want to offer at least a slightly up note before we close today, since it's been a pretty depressing call, but we're talking about anti-Semitism, one of the things that I continue to be heartened by is that even though anti-Semitism continues to rear its ugly head, that Jew hatred is on the rise among extremes in our society and British society, right? UK labor leader fires lawmaker over an anti-Semitic tweet, that the responses are still out there. The norms in society still say that intolerance of Jews, hatred of Jews, demonization of Jews in the public sphere is unacceptable. That the NFL and the Philadelphia Eagles responded, that the labor movement, the Labor Party in Great Britain has eventually responded. It's taken a long time. I don't know, Bridget, if the French government will respond or has.
It wasn't until the 1990s that they admitted they had actively deported Jewish people. So it took them quite a while. And even still, sometimes people are killed. Yes.
And, American history is rife with not admitting crimes. So we have a lot of work to do. When we do this work, though, it is best when we draw our alliances with other people. And I recently consulted with a student about their bat mitzvah Devar Torah, their speech for their bat mitzvah. And I talked about the difference between whining about something that we find momentarily unfair and protesting about a bigger injustice. And the difference is whether or not it's just happening to me, or whether it's happening to me because I'm a class of people who are also being afflicted and oppressed. When we draw our oppression into a larger context of societies that oppress not just Jews, but lots of people for lots of reasons, we have a chance of making a difference. Because then we are saying there is an injustice done to people as a class, as a group, not just for my own self-interest. Our self-interest, our enlightened self-interest counts, but it counts more when we place it on principled footing. And with that, I wish all of you a healthy and safe and enjoyable afternoon. May you stay cool. May we all come through to a safer and healthier and more peaceful tomorrow and soon. Take care, everybody. Thank you all for showing up today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you. It's very
Bye-bye.
interesting.